It gives me great pleasure on behalf of AccesSportAmerica and the participating co-chairs and all the organizations to welcome you all this morning to the second annual forum, Extending Our Reach, the Case for Ambitious Lifelong Programs. I'm Chris McIntosh. I'm the publisher of the Boston Business Journal and Mass High Tech. But more importantly, I'm an Access Sport board member. I'm also the advisory chair. And I can tell you, I sit on 9 other nonprofit boards and in the city here, and AccesSportAmerica is the one I'm most deeply involved in, mostly due to the hard work that Ross and the Access Sport staff put together every single day. So I just want to get a round of applause for. And obviously, with the pending snowstorm coming in, Barbara and the Access Sport staff planned an amazing forum for us this morning. We have some amazing speakers. They get it done well before anything can happen. So be safe tomorrow, but a testament to the work that the staff at Access Sport does. I think you'll enjoy yourselves this morning. As many of you are aware, on January 25th of this year, the U.S. Department of Education issued a guidance clarifying the school district's obligation to provide equal and extracurricular activities, athletic activities for students with disabilities. In a moment, Ross will speak about Access Sport's in-school conditioning and sports programs presently in 6 Boston public schools, and efforts towards providing daily conditioning as well as after-school programs in collaboration with Boys and Girls Clubs of Boston and Partners for Youth with Disabilities. Now, please join me in appreciation to the Millennium Boston Hotel and our host, Robert Rivers, General Manager and fellow Access Sport board member, for hosting this forum for a second consecutive year. This annual forum is built to foster collaborations to inspire greater physical, cognitive, and social function of children and adults living with disabilities, lifelong opportunities to improve the quality of life, health, and well-being. Today's forum will address the value and importance of quality programming for children and adults living with disabilities with a focus on increasing opportunities and funding. Today, corporate, foundation, philanthropic, government, and program leaders have come together so that we may gain insights into the values and importance of quality programs and how to best increase opportunities so that we are all more actively engaged in solutions. Together, we are the roots of the tree, encouraging all children and adults of all abilities to flourish and grow. We hope that you are both inspired and challenged this morning, inspired to offer, to fund, and to provide leadership for programs and individuals living with disabilities so that every child and adult are provided equal opportunities. With pleasure, I now welcome to the podium Ross Lilly, Executive Director and Founder of AccesSportAmerica.
I probably won't talk about our program in school because I think you just did it. And I think you expressed everything I wanted to express as well. But I will say, I'll start by saying I'm challenged. And I have issues. And I have a lot of issues. And I know a lot of you, and I know a lot of you have issues. And I know a lot of you are challenged. I have a son with cerebral palsy, and I have many friends who live with disabilities. And I don't mean to trivialize what they go through on a daily basis, but they're challenged and I'm challenged. And throughout my life, I need to be challenged. I need to grow and I need to stretch. And I need to think that even in the 96th year of my life, I could have the best year of my life and contribute the most to my society. I need to believe that in a day or minute, everything in my life could become fulfilled, and I'm going towards my best part of my life. And for me, there are those opportunities to do that. There are opportunities for me in the arts, in education and in training and sports. It's all there for me to keep going and improving and being better. We are here because it doesn't necessarily go for every member of the society, especially with those with more profound or obvious challenges. Ours may be hidden. They may be ever so difficult to get up in a day. Who knows? But we work with people who live with, we'll call disabilities or more involved challenges, and with the acknowledgement that we have to provide programming that is long-term. We need to work with funders who are in for the long term. We need to work with educators in the state, and the recognition that no one can do it alone. And I think that's why we're here, is to hold the bar higher so no one becomes a mascot, right? And no one's in the corner, and that we believe anybody can be brought out and have a significant contribution. So I thank you all for coming here. There are going to be 4 speakers today, right? Okay, 1 has license to go on and on and on. 3 have been revoked of their license to go on and on. We'll have a little shorter speech. At the end of all theirs, we'll bring them back up for some questions and input or comments. Does that sound okay by everybody? Okay? So I'm sure there's some of you sitting here who think, I should be speaking today. And maybe you're right. If you have a good, succinct comment or question later, we'll consider you for next year. But that will be after everybody speaks. So again, I thank you for coming, and I thank the Millennium Bostonian. Our first speaker, Thomas Hare, is consult to presidents, popes, and pundits. Any popes in there, Tom? We could work on that. He was an assistant superintendent of schools in Chicago, director of the special education in the city of Boston, teaches at Harvard now, and more importantly, if you go to his office, there are some pretty impressive pictures. He has pictures with notables and with family and with students, and I think it speaks a lot of him that some of the best pictures there are very clear that he cares deeply, and there's a love that's shared between students and himself, and how he cares deeply for this. And when he talks about ableism, he's not talking about some cute term of what we can and can't do. He's talking about holding the bar higher for people living with significant challenges. So let's welcome Thomas Hare.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. Good morning.
What a beautiful day. I just walked down here from my home in the South End. I figured all the sidewalks were clear, and this was a sports event. And I said, I'm not taking the T, I'm not walking. And so I'm very, very happy to be here today. I'm going to talk a bit about the concept of ableism. How many of you have heard that term before, ableism? Every time I speak, it seems like more people have, but lots of people haven't. And I want to talk about that term, but I specifically want to talk about it in relationship to the concept of access and the importance of sports and having access to everything. As Ross said when he introduced me about how people who don't have disabilities, I do not have a disability yet, but if I'm lucky someday I will, because it will mean I will live a long life. Because by the time you're 80, about 80% of people have some form of disability. So I'm hopeful that someday I will have a disability, because it will mean I've lived a long life. But people who don't have disabilities often take for granted things that people with this, as Ross said, we take for granted access. We take for granted access to education, access to sports, access to housing, access to friendships, relationships. Often, all of those things there are obstacles for people with disabilities. And as someone who's, I spent most of my career working, continue to, in the field of special education, or what I prefer to say, the education of children with disabilities. Because children with disabilities shouldn't just need something special. They should also get what every other kid gets in the education system. So I prefer to say that my career is about the education of children with disabilities, of which special education is a vehicle to education, or an access vehicle. Several years ago, I went to work for President Clinton. I was the director of the Federal Office of Special Education, which oversees the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. When I first went to work for President Clinton, President Clinton was the first president who hired people with disabilities to oversee programs for people with disabilities. One of the issues that many people in the disability community have had is the issue of paternalism, is programs being run by non-disabled people for people with disabilities, and often not necessarily with enough consumer input of the people who actually have been served by programs. So when President Clinton became president, it was only 3 years after the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. And many of the people who advocated for that act were people with disabilities themselves. The ADA was the first piece of disability legislation that was primarily driven by people with disabilities. And many of those folks who were active in advocating in Washington for the ADA became appointees in the Clinton administration. And so actually, I was the only person who was running a major disability program who didn't have a disability. And so my colleagues who had disabilities across the government, there are a lot of different programs that in various agencies that deal with disability. Actually, one of the challenges in the field of disability is oftentimes agencies don't talk together. Housing agencies, employment agencies, education agencies operate as silos. And one of the things that we tried to do when we were in Washington was try to get everybody together. And so the opportunity that we had during the Clinton administration was that these agencies were largely, number one, run by people with disabilities, and they knew each other. It was a club. And I had never been in the club. I had spent my career working for children with disabilities, but I wasn't part of the community of people with disabilities. And I was for the first time in my life included in this community. So these folks, my boss is Judy Heumann. Anybody know who Judy Heumann is? Yeah, I mean, she's an important person. Probably the closest thing in the disability community to someone like Martin Luther King, to be honest. And so Judy was my boss. She had polio when she was 18 months old. She had been excluded from school in the largest school district in the country, New York City Public Schools. Judy is an amazing, amazing woman. And so she was my boss. And she was like the highest ranking person in the government who had a disability. So she used to call us all together to talk about policy issues. You know, what is the president going to request for appropriations in this agency, et cetera, et cetera? How do we get housing and employment together? All those kinds of things that we would talk about. And they used to send out emails that would say, disabled appointees plus Tom, because they were inclusive. And so this is a very roundabout way to talk about this. But anyhow, when I was first in Washington, I met with my boss, who was Secretary Riley, and he asked me how the kids with disabilities did on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP. And I said, well, Mr. Secretary, I don't know. He said, well, Tom, he was from South Carolina, he had a Southern accent. He couldn't imitate my accent. I can't really imitate his. But he said, would y'all give me a report on that? And I said, well, Mr. Secretary, I can't. And he said, well, why? And I said, because kids with disabilities don't take the paper. They don't. And so in 1993, we couldn't answer the question in the United States, are kids with disabilities learning to read? Are they learning mathematics? We couldn't answer the question. And I had previously, before going to Washington, had worked in Chicago as associate superintendent of schools, and I had tried unsuccessfully in Chicago to get kids with disabilities to be part of the assessment system. Because I felt, you know, it's not just good enough to give kids special education. We have to know the results of special education. We need to know the results of education for kids with disabilities. So anyhow, make a long story short. I guess I'm not making it that short. we had a meeting of my colleagues who had disabilities. And I was talking about this to them, about this issue of kids not being part of the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And Judy turned to me and said, don't you get it, Tom? And I said, well, I know this is complicated. You have to have accommodations. There were kids with intellectual disabilities, blah, 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 blah. I'm giving all the technocratic answers. And what Judy said, don't you get it, Tom? It's ableism. And I'm thinking, ableism? I'm reasonably intelligent. I could figure out. I knew what sexism was. I knew what homophobia was. And I was thinking, I get what ableism means. And everybody around the table, just club, all were shaking their heads. Yeah, Tom, it's ableism. And I had never heard the term before. And it was transformative for me as a person who has worked in this field his whole life. And basically what the concept of ableism is, it's just like sexism and racism and homophobia. It is, deeply ingrained societal prejudice against a group that affects everything that goes on for that group within society. So that the notion that, and they said, don't you understand, Tom, it's ableism. They, meaning non-disabled people, don't think we are capable. And that's why they're not included in the name. And so, of course, that's changed. That's a wonderful thing. And so when the recent guidance came out from the Secretary of Education on access to sports and athletics, my first reaction is, why didn't we do that? Because I think it's so overdue. But, I grew up in a very strict Catholic background, so I think about what I have done and what I have failed to do. Some of you will know what statement means. And I started feeling guilty when this guidance came out. And but I realized that what we were trying to do in 1993 was get kids access to the curriculum. In other words, the concept that children with disabilities should be learning in school what other kids are learning. And that was a step forward at that time. And I can remember when we had, when I started out in this career, when there were 13 institutions in this state, in Massachusetts, 13 state schools, they called them, for kids with intellectual disabilities, or as they said then, students with mental retardation. 13 of them. And I remember as a young professional, actually a student, going to Belchertown, which was one of the state institutions in Massachusetts, and seeing rows and rows and rows of beds, in which these steel beds, in which kids largely with cerebral palsy, or some kids with muscular dystrophy, kids with physical disabilities, because Belchertown was one of the places that had kids with physical disabilities, some of whom had intellectual disabilities, some of whom did not, in which kids were kept for 20 hours a day in a cage, literally. And that was done by the state of Massachusetts. And it was done by every single state in this country, up until really the 80s. And one of the reasons that was done was because people had a conception of people with disabilities that didn't hold any hope for a future. That didn't hold the notion that everybody in one of these cages, I'm using the word cages because that's what it looked like to me when I was 20 years old. Everybody in one of these, confined in one of these cages, was a person with rights. At that time, we hadn't even established until the middle 70s that people with disabilities had rights as citizens. That the government didn't even recognize the fundamental right to education. I started teaching in the early 70s in Framingham at Keefe Tech, which is a regional vocational technical school. At that time, a new law had passed here in Massachusetts called Chapter 766, which was the which predated the passage of the federal law of IDEA. Massachusetts actually was one of the states that led in expanding educational opportunity for kids with disabilities. And so I had the opportunity to teach at a school that was integrating kids, even kids with significant disabilities, one of the few in the state at the time. And I can remember a number of experiences I had that I think is very relevant to this organization. And I remember my boss coming to me after my first year of teaching and saying to me, Tom, you have to teach phys ed next year. And I said, what? And he said, well, you know, of the 4 special ed teachers in the building, you're the most athletic, which I was, okay? But that wasn't a high standard. and so when I said to my boss, I said, well, you know, I don't even know CPR. Aren't phys ed teachers supposed to at least know CPR? Not to mention things like curriculum. And I said, well, why are you telling me I have to teach phys ed? And he said, well, you know, we have these kids with multiple disabilities. Or all kinds of, kids he was talking about mostly were kids with multiple disabilities, and they have to get credit for phys ed to graduate. And so I said, but Walter, his name was Walter. I said, let me think of a different alternative. And so I talked to my friends who were in the phys ed department, and I said, why don't I teach a class with one of you, because you know how to teach phys ed, I don't. Where we will have the kids with multiple disabilities with kids without disabilities. And it was one of the most rewarding teaching experiences I had because I got to see my kids in a different environment, in a pool, on a field, et cetera, et cetera. And I remember this one kid that I had. I remember actually several kids I had. But this one kid that really brought it home to me. And he was a boy with Down syndrome. And he was in my phys ed class. And we were in the pool, and this kid lifted weights. Had a rippled stomach. And he was very different than many of my other students, many of whom, unfortunately, were overweight. This kid was, he was an athlete. Okay, he was an athlete. And so we were in the pool, and I said, look at this kid swim. And I said, this kid swims like a fish. And so I called up his dad, and I found out his dad was a coach. I mean, it was really kind of obvious why he was the way he was. He was the only son. He had 3 sisters. Sexism. And so anyhow, and I said, to his dad, I said, I want him on the swim team. I mean, he swims much faster than most of the non-disabled kids in the school. But he had never been in a pool over his head. Never been in a pool over his head. And so I took him after school and desensitized him to the deep end of the pool. And he was on our swim team. And this was 1974, at Keefe Tech in Framingham. I subsequently skied on expert slopes with this kid. This kid was just an athlete like you would not believe. But boy, was he an exception. Was he an exception? And for the vast majority of kids who have disabilities, even today, having access to sports is something that is just not there. Too often kids are mascots. Sometimes, if they're lucky, if they have good interpersonal skills, et cetera, they may be mascots, but they're not often players. Last year I had the opportunity, I was working doing some consulting work in a school in Long Island, the Henry Viscardi School, which is a school for kids with very, very significant physical disabilities. Most of the kids go to this school because the mainstream schools haven't been accommodating to them. Their parents send them to these, we did a survey of the parents in the school, and virtually all of the parents wanted their kids to be included in typical schools, but when they went to typical schools, what the parents said was the kids had no friends. They didn't have the kind of related services like physical therapy and occupational therapy they really needed. So even though I'm a big supporter of inclusive education, sometimes schools, even today, are still not providing the opportunities and inclusive environments that kids need. So I was at Henry Viscardi, and I had the opportunity to watch a basketball game of the kids. Now, people are very familiar with wheelchair basketball, right? You see it on TV and so forth. Usually people in wheelchair basketball teams are people with spinal cord injuries, and often have a lot of strength, upper body strength. Well, these kids have cerebral palsy. These kids have muscular dystrophy. These kids have spinal muscular atrophy. They have by and large disabilities that affect their whole bodies. And this basketball game was another epiphany in my life. There was not a kid who wasn't participating. There was not a kid, no matter what level of physical disability. And there were 3 levels of the basket. And the kids knew which level was their level. There were some kids who did have upper body strength who could actually, who could really hit the basket very, very well. And there were other kids who needed a little assistance, just a little assistance to get into the basket that may have been 6 inches in front of their face. But everybody was part of the team. And this is what we need more of in this country. And this is one of the things I feel so strongly about with this guidance that came out just a couple of weeks ago. And I think about the experience that we've had in this country around Title IX as it relates to women in athletics. I mean, some of you may be, judging by the data I can assume here, that some of you probably remember the days when there wasn't equal sports between women and men in high schools. I remember the high school I went to, Burncoat High in Worcester, Mass. I think there were 3 girls' sports. There was probably a dozen boys' sports. Okay, is that right? Some of you have that experience when you were going to school as well. When you think of what Title IX has done in this country, it's a tremendous success. It's been a tremendous success. And this policy guidance that the department has promulgated, it tracks Title IX. It basically says, the concept of that kids need to not be discriminated against because they have a disability. Okay? That if a kid can be accommodated on a sports team, he should be. And you see that happening here and there. I saw this thing on TV the other day for a kid with Down syndrome, one of the suburbs, who was part of a wrestling team. And I said, boy, that's great. This is all progress. It also says, you take kids like the kids at the Henry Viscardi School, you have to have some alternatives for these kids who can't make the team. So it's both access and alternatives, just like Title IX. Title IX said, that women need to have access to sports, but you need to recognize that there are differences by gender in terms of physicality. And there needs to be equal opportunities for women in sports. Now, the opportunities that have been provided to women in sports in this country, of course, have had value for individual women in terms of physical development. Again, we value sports because of its health impact, but we also value sports because of its social impact. Having networks and so forth. And right now in this country, the vast majority of kids who have significant disabilities do not have this access. They don't, but they should. Because we know that with Title IX, one of the things I have to deal with as a professor is being able to make causal statements. And so, when you're talking about something like Title IX, can you say Title IX caused more women to be in boardrooms? Can you say Title IX caused more women to be in Congress? Maybe not. But I think it had a big impact. I was reading an article. A friend of mine posted a piece on Facebook the other day, and I didn't know this. I used to work for her, but that Hillary Clinton, when she was a kid, had sent a letter to NASA saying how could she become an astronaut. And she got back a letter saying, well, girls can't be astronauts. And now she's the departing Secretary of State, and who knows what next. But when we look at Title IX, what Title IX, I believe, was all part of, it was all part of a movement for equality. This policy guidance as it relates to sports, and what this organization does is the same thing. Because part of what we need to be thinking about, all of us as a society, is the fact that we are not at a place where people with disabilities have equality. We're actually pretty far away from that. But this policy guidance, I think, is part of a long march for equality for people with disabilities, certainly in education. And I believe that if we take this seriously, this great opportunity, I think this is a great opportunity. And Ross sent me an email when it came out, and I said, right on, you're right on that, man. I think this is a great opportunity today to really push this issue, because it's not just about sports. It's about life, and having a full life, and having a society in which we eliminate ableism. Thank you very much.
Yeah, as it is not all about sports, and again, this forum is not all about sports. That's one of the reasons we invited Regina Snowden. And when Regina, many of you know Regina Snowden, don't you? When Regina's in a room, you know she's there, right? As I can see, in the nonprofit for people living with disabilities, Regina's pretty much been here longer than anybody in Boston. And Partners for Youth it's an ingenious, very sustainable, powerful model. Some of us here are mentors, and ignore those guys. We have to send our trainers off to a school. Don't forget to change your clothes. Regina's program, her system is ingenious, and it's one that's very much on a peer level. And as we're talking, having a peer when you're living with a disability is really rare, and especially when you're integrated into sections of society where you are mostly on the outside. So to create a place where you belong and to create a system of peers is extraordinary in other programs. So let's invite, thank you, Regina Snowden.
And thank you so much for that wonderful, Tom, for that wonderful message. I was listening attentively, thinking about my own path in social work. Yours has been more in the education realm. And I followed what you said with such interest as you talked about your history and seeing the difference throughout your career in making change. And indeed, I've been around a while. In 1985, I started Partners for Youth with Disabilities, which began as a mentoring program for youth with disabilities. I was a social worker serving what's still called at-risk youth, generally referred to youth that are from the inner city, neighborhoods that are challenging, ethnicity, discrimination, violence. Most programs at that time for youth were targeted at that population. And I would get phone calls from parents of children with disabilities seeking access to programs like that, like a Big Brother, Big Sister program, like a Boys and Girls Club, like a sport program, trying to engage their child in being able to reach their potential, knowing that the disability would be the barrier when they would try to get into any of these programs. And it was. So to make a long story short, because I've been given short speech, I started a program. Well, I was already working with a program with mentoring, and I saw the value and the impact that mentoring was on the lives of young people. And so I thought, well, I'll just include youth with disabilities in this already existing program. And the obvious mentor for these young people would be another person with a disability, similar often to their own. And accidentally hit on, some nearly 30 years ago, huge unmet need. vast population of children with disabilities, vast diversity in disability, nothing for them on a year-round basis, where they could go to and find recreation, sport, community, potential building, people they could identify with, adults they could identify, where they could grow up and say, that's somebody I'm going to be when I grow up. I'm going to be like that. I can do sport. I can do career. I can do living. I can have a vocation, social life. They weren't seeing it. And I was fascinated by when they would have the opportunity to meet their adult. They would say, you live in your own apartment. I've never met an adult with a disability. This is 30 years ago. These children were not even being exposed to a huge population of adults that were out there making change and beginning the civil rights movement for people with disabilities. And I've been saying since I started Partners and to this day, I'm so grateful for my career. I get the chance to meet the most interesting people in the world. The adults that I meet and the accomplishments that they achieve, and they're wanting to give back to these children, and these children looking at these accomplishments and recognizing then their own abilities. And it's often through sport. And then 10 years later, Ross, something like that, it begins Access Sport, and more programs are being developed, and I'm getting so excited. What I started, I think, was probably one of the first. I'm sure there were others. But then something was in the air. Change was in the air. Education, social services, it was in the air. It was happening. Inevitably, young people with disabilities at long last were being given these fabulous opportunities like Access Sport. What a genius program this is. And I have loved the collaboration with Ross. It's been truly the most fun collaboration. We bring his team over to our Making Healthy Connections program, which is so relevant to Access Sport, and they get a chance to become involved with Access Sport. The collaboration has been one of the finest. And what his team does has been of the finest, highest quality level there could be. And for young people with disabilities to realize and achieve and accomplish sport and be exposed to mentors. That's my motto, these wonderful mentors in the community, and to see them accomplish through sport and recreation, through Access Sport, and to work together now with the Boys and Girls Club, now with other institutions, youth-serving institutions that are welcoming and being inclusive, now with major corporations like Liberty Mutual saying, let's all be inclusive, let's all be together in sport, in recreation, in opportunities. And it's just the most celebratory time of my career to see what's happened over these last 30 years. We also have the theater program. We have an entrepreneurship program that teaches job readiness and preparedness for employment. And we have a peer program. We have a National Center program that teaches how to replicate our program in other areas. And I want to close with a quote that I think personifies what we all want to accomplish here today, and exposing youth to mentors and exposing them to programs like Access Sport and the kinds of individuals that they can meet through Access Sport and through our other youth-serving programs, and the impact of mentoring. And this is from a tremendous mentor at Partners, who some of you may know. I use this quote often, every chance I get. You may have heard me speak of it before. It's from the late Judge Reginald Lindsay, who was fascinated, in fact, by watching young people with sports become active in both Partners and through any of the other programs like Access Sport that he would get a chance to be exposed to. So, quoting Judge Lindsay, the mentors do not guide simply by words, although they always speak words of encouragement, strength, and comfort. Mentors primarily guide by their own lives, by the lessons of their own achievements, and by the grace of their bearing in a world that frequently misunderstands, even devalues people with disabilities. By just being themselves, mentors demonstrate that society is wrong when it says that if you have a disability, all you can aspire to is public lordship. By just being themselves, our mentors demonstrate that society is wrong when it says if you have a disability, you have no ability and are not capable of adding value to the world.
By just being themselves, mentors demonstrate that society is wrong when it says if you have a disability, you cannot, indeed you should not, feel good about yourself. By just being themselves, our mentors demonstrate life-affirming, life-enriching values. Our mentors are paradigms of survival, adaptation, and socialization. They teach entrepreneurship. They teach health awareness. They teach sport. They teach political and advocacy skills. They teach independence and self-reliance. They teach empowerment. Franklin Roosevelt himself, a man with a disability, said, "We cannot always build the future for ourselves. Excuse me. We cannot always build the future for our youth, but we can build our youth for the future." Our mentors in their day-to-day interactions with their mentees are about business of building youth, our youth, for the future. Thank you, Access Sport, for the mentoring organization that you are and for how you show young people sport and recreation in every service and endeavor that you do. Thank you.
I've been asked to talk to you about Liberty Mutual's efforts to be more inclusive and better support people with disabilities, and also tell you a bit about the lessons that we're going along the way. Helping people with disabilities lead fuller lives is part of our company's culture. Throughout our history as a leading workers' comp provider, Liberty has been concerned with helping people safely return to work after debilitating on-the-job injuries. In fact, the Liberty Mutual Research Institute in Hopkinton is world-renowned for its contributions to development of car safety belts and airbags, but equally renowned for its innovations leading to better lives for people with disabilities. For example, that's much better. The Boston Elbow and the Boston Digital Arm. Along with low-income individuals, or youth, and homeless individuals and families, people with disabilities have always been a target population of the foundation. Although we called out this population in our guidelines, our approach has been passive. We relied on the community finding us before we would engage. While reviewing our giving a few years ago, we realized that there was more that we could be doing. For example, in 2011, our 3 U.S. foundations gave a combined total of $12.1 million. Of this, 250 went to programs targeting people with disabilities. So this is about 2%. And we knew that if we had a more intentional approach to our giving, we could do better than just 2%. The first thing is that we knew we faced a very steep learning curve. So we reached out to the Philanthropic Initiative. We had worked with TPI in the past, where worked with other disability funders, and their contributions to our learning were invaluable. And then we found a partner that was not only professionally engaged, but also with the issue, but also passionate about access and inclusion for everyone. And by working with TPI, we were able to fast track our learning. Once we felt we had a good conceptual understanding of the landscape, we reached out to Regina. Everyone here knew her. Everyone we talked to, who should we engage, mentioned Regina and PYD. So we reached out to Regina and PYD. Since launch, PYD has been a true partner, helping to fine-tune our ideas, check our assumptions. Early on, they facilitated a lunch discussion for Liberty and some of our community partners, and many of you here today were there. We presented what we had arrived at, what we had planned to do based on our research and our work with PYD, and asked for feedback. And from those steps, what emerged for us was sort of a path forward. We decided that we would pursue a two-pronged approach. The first was that we would continue to make investments in programs that targeted people with disabilities. And the second was that we would make additional resources available to our existing partners to help them be more inclusive. And the second part is really important to us. We already take great pride in supporting what we believe are the best-in-class agencies in the city, and we aren't interested in supporting a separate but equal system for people with disabilities. Instead, we are committed to helping the very best providers become inclusive. So that has been our journey. What have we learned? We've learned that it's important to take your time to do research, get to know the community, and also know how to best leverage your resources. We've learned that it's okay to be humble. We acknowledge not having all the answers. and that we're on our own journey to be more inclusive. An example of this is we tend to host these training sessions at our building, which is accessible. It never occurred to us to include a statement about accessibility in our invitations. And now that we're a little bit smaller, we started doing that and are seeing more people with disabilities come to these training sessions. We've also learned that it's important to be visible. It wasn't enough to say in our guidelines that we cared about people with disabilities. We now understand that we have to go out and initiate the conversation. And finally, we've learned that it helps to have guides and navigators at different vantage points. In both TPI and PYD, we found wonderfully giving friends who are committed to seeing our foundation succeed. While TPI gave us a high-level overview of the landscape, PYD brought an underground perspective that has been vital to our strategy. Perhaps the foundation would have arrived at this place on its own, perhaps not, but I think that by working with partners that knew more than us, we were able to arrive here faster. So to summarize, we've researched, we've humbled ourselves, we've reached out to partners, and we hooked up with the very best experts that we could find. It's so early to report on impact, but on one measure, our investments, I'm happy to report that we've made marked progress. In 2012, the Liberty Mutual Foundation awarded $900,000 to programs serving people with disabilities. So that's a 260% improvement over 2011. And to make that real, to make that real, it means that children with disability will now be able to visit the Children's Museum at a time when the museum is open only for them. It means that teens with disabilities will be able to get their first summer jobs through the Private Industry Council's very first summer jobs programs for teens with disabilities. So our journey starts with a lot of research, advice, and counsel from many of you here in this room, and it ends with people with disabilities having greater opportunities to more fully participate in our city. Thank you. I now have the pleasure of introducing Jean Whitney. Jean is the Executive Director of the Carl and Luke Shapiro Foundation and Board Chair of Associated Grantmakers. Jean provided key leadership in launching the first annual forum last year. The forum is in keeping with a key initiative of the Shapiro's Disability Inclusion Initiative, which was established in 2000 to provide support and equal opportunities for people living with disabilities. Jean?
It's a great honor to be here today among such an auspicious group of presenters and audience members. There's so many of you who are doing such great work for the cause of inclusion for persons with disabilities. I'm truly humbled to be part of the program. I'm here today, as you've heard, representing a funder who has invested in expanding opportunities for people with disabilities for almost a decade. When we did our original field research in the course of developing a funding strategy for our Disability Inclusion Initiative, we went out and we met with a lot of individuals and organizations who are already involved in this work. Increasing opportunities in sports and recreation was identified as a real need by several of the groups that we met with. Sports and recreation were seen as an important part of the quality of life index. So the Shapiro Family Foundation has supported a variety of programs over the years, operating support to new adaptive sports programs, trying to help others expand, supporting some models that involve integrated programming for persons with and without disabilities. We've also provided some non-grant support in the form of meeting facilitation for a couple of years to a group of organizations who really just wanted to come together to work together to improve the field. Today, this group calls itself the Greater Boston Access to Recreation Group, and it is working to collaborate with 60 organizations in the Greater Boston area to develop an action agenda to expand opportunities for participation of people with disabilities in sports and recreation. Overall, the foundation's support in this field has been a small piece of the pie. The many others, public and private, have also contributed to many worthwhile efforts in this area. Which brings me to the theme of today's program, this part of today's program, shared responsibility. I want to share a few thoughts today on the notion of shared responsibility and where this takes us. I know that we share the vision that individuals with disabilities have the opportunities to participate in society to their fullest extent, to have a good quality of life, and to reach their potentials. So we share the vision and we share the responsibility. But how do we get from one to the other? How do we reach the vision? I wonder whether the vision is really as clear as we think. As promoters of universal design will tell you, when you design a built environment or a method of teaching or a cultural experience that is inclusive by design, everyone benefits. I know that we can all think of several adaptations that have been made for persons with disabilities that have had broad benefits. Think of curb cuts, ramps, captioning, voice recognition software. I wonder if the vision that laid the groundwork for the development of these adaptations was as universal and broad-based as the impact they eventually had. What we can take from this, and we know it already, is that a more inclusive society will be better, not just for persons with disabilities, but for people of all abilities. For those of you who may not have been here last year, who were here last year, I know you have not forgotten the story that was told by the director, Kara, the director of Camp Harborview, about the talent show that took place at Camp Harborview and the transformative performance of one of the special campers when she performed for everyone and belted out her favorite popular tunes. All the campers were touched by the performance. They showed respect and admiration towards a person that they may never have even dared to speak to before. What I want to suggest is that as we articulate our vision for a more inclusive community and culture, we consider carefully how we make the case for it, how we are framing it for the public, for organizations and institutions, and for policymakers. Perhaps we need to start with the broad vision. Everyone needs to be healthy, to be active, and to be fit for life. Who can argue with that? Then we can spell out where the disparities occur and lay out our plans to eliminate them. Okay, so we've got the shared responsibility at one end, and we've got the broadly framed vision at the other end. What's in between? I believe there are three things: communication, collaboration, and shared strategies. In other words, we have to work together. Let me share a few promising things that I think are underway right now. In the communication area, in the past year, Associated Grantmakers, the membership organization for funders in the state, has convened a disability funders affinity group, a forum for private grantmakers to share information and strategies about their funding in this area. It's still small, but it's growing. And Allison Goldhagen is here from AGM and can tell you more about it if you're interested. Allison, put up your hand. The group also wants to connect with public funders in the future as well. Another group that's reached out and is thinking of communication and is eager to share its research-based work is the Lurie Center on Disability Policy at Brandeis University's Heller School. We are blessed with many fine academic institutions in this part of the world, and we need to be communicating. They're all doing work, no doubt, that would benefit our efforts. The potential benefits of better communication between these kinds of academic resources and the community-based work we're all involved in are great. Collaboration. I've already mentioned GBAR, a group of organizations that includes the state DCR's Universal Access Program too, who are working together to find better ways to offer professional development, volunteer training, and to disseminate information about accessible sports and recreation. Another effort that falls in the collaboration area is an experiment that our foundation, along with the J.E. and Z.B. Butler Foundation, has undertaken over the past year. We call it the Disability Task Force, and we just had our 6th meeting. It began essentially as an offer by our foundations to organize and facilitate regular meetings of nonprofit organizations working in the disability arena for sharing information and collaborations around 3 chosen issue areas. While it started with our grantees, anyone is welcome to participate. Recently, the United Way of Mass Bay and Merrimack Valley attended our meeting and spoke to the group about legislative advocacy. And this is something that the group may decide to rally around in the future. I'd be remiss if I failed to mention the collaboration in the collaboration category, the many significant partnerships that so many nonprofits have with the Boston Public Schools. All partnerships that exist to enhance and expand services to students with disabilities. As a large urban system, the BPS is, by definition, complex and at times a challenging partner. Nonprofits often have to work very hard to make and sustain successful partnerships, and the results can sometimes be varied. However, recent meetings that our foundation had with some nonprofit partners in the BPS have been really encouraging. BPS administrators have been open to listening, to helping, and to collaborating to make these partnerships stronger and more beneficial for the students. There are undoubtedly plenty of examples of other collaborations at work. You've already heard today of the important efforts of Partners for Youth with Disabilities and other significant players of Boys and Girls Clubs, Camp Harborview, Triangle and Malden, UMass Boston, Pierce Park Sailing, the list goes on. Of course, I can't fail to mention AccesSportAmerica, whose groundbreaking leadership in this crusade really stands out. This is their 2nd annual forum designed to bring us all together for inspiration and collaboration. And that brings us to the most challenging part of getting from responsibility to the fulfillment of our vision: shared strategies. Yes, we do collaborate, and we're trying to do more of that and to do it better. And we do communicate. That's sort of the first step. But are we really working together strategically on a common strategic plan? You do that part, I'll do that part, we'll do this part together. Can we see the whole, and can we see our part in it? Speaking as a funder, I know we have a long way to go, even though I think we are communicating and collaborating more. Of course, it's easy to talk and much harder to act. If we leave this forum this morning, as we leave this forum this morning, perhaps we can each individually resolve to communicate more with one another, to collaborate more with one another, to think collectively about how we will frame our arguments or make our cases for a more inclusive community. Then maybe we can make more progress towards sharing strategies and working together toward our common vision. So funders, public and private, go see Allison Goldhagen from AGM about the Disability Funders Working Group. Nonprofits, you're welcome to find out more and join in with the Disability Task Force. And I would encourage you to talk and work with one another. Government representatives and the public schools, we need you to be part of this conversation. Tell us the best way to involve you. Corporate and business representatives, you have the power to help us articulate and share the broad vision. Please join in. Thank you.
Oh.
When you have a question, Nate will come to you and offer you the microphone so you can voice your question, comment, easily. So, are there any that come to mind right off the bat?
You don't do that. This is probably directed to Gene or Regina. Since the DOE guideline announcement. One, have you seen inspired organizations like ours, as in a different direction or a lifeline? In other words, we've got a mission now, a stronger mission. And two, has it been, and probably more importantly, something that the funding community has been longing for to almost legitimatize and give more credence to the vision and the cause?
I guess I can say, from my perspective, it's great to have this sort of extra muscle behind really what I think was already laid out in the ADA, that there should be opportunities and there should be access. So it draws attention to the fact that this, there's still work to be done. I think it may, it's one of those awareness-raising things that sometimes it really provides the opportunity for renewed effort, and I think may have the result, I don't know, in some new funding being directed towards this kind of thing. As Tom had mentioned, Title IX, I don't know if we can compare this completely to Title IX, but sometimes when there is this decree, this mandate that's renewed when it comes to sort of civil rights kinds of issues, it can give the issue just sort of the extra push it needs to move forward. Richie, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Really? What she said.
I do think that there is. I do think this is more parallel to Title IX than you might think, because it is tied to Section 504, not so much the ADA. One of the things that if the department enforces this the way it enforced Title IX, it could have a huge impact because it's tied to funding. The ADA is not a funding bill. Section 504 is tied to education funding. So, for instance, I think these things take time, but I do think that this falls on particularly fertile ground, in the sense that much of the progress that's been made by people with disabilities, in my view, has been made because of the strength of the law. And if, particularly parents of kids with disabilities, in my view, have been one of the major catalysts to change in this country. And part of that has been them seeking enforcement. And what's for me, looking at what the Secretary put out, I think it's a matter of time where some parents are going to start saying, wait a second, let's look at the participation rate of kids with disabilities in athletics in school districts. Just like feminist groups did as it related to women in sports. And if the department, which I hope it does, enforces and actually requires school districts and universities and so forth to really take this seriously, I think that the type of work that this organization does becomes a resource, becomes a solution within that environment. So I don't think it's happening right away. It's only 2 weeks, right? But from my perspective, I think I'm thrilled that it happened, and I do think it's more parallel. I really do.
Peter, you got something?
Yes, I just have one question. What can we do for adults with disabilities? So much money goes to 22, and yet we're talking about lifelong. That's where we run. I work with adults with brain injury. That's where we run into troubles.
Dina.
Thank you for asking that, because certainly our program has been all about youth, and now that we've been around for 30 years, our youth are adults. We've got youth that are so adults by now, and parents are concerned, and they're coming to us, and there's kind of a mix to this. I've had the wonderful privilege of seeing partners indeed in programs certainly like AccesSport can say the same thing by now. They've just had the privilege of seeing these kids succeed in large part because of the work we're doing. And we get to see the change. The young people that come through our programs, but we sadly, some of them, it's not 100% rate. And now that these programs are around long enough, and we're seeing that it's not a 100% success rate, and parents are saying transition is the buzzword. You asked the right question. Transition is a huge buzzword right now within the disability transition to adult life. And parents are more and more and more concerned. And there is more and more and more speaking to it. And as far as what we can do, I think it just, there's no magic answer that I have to say, except that I know that programs like ours do prepare young people for the adult world, for career, through sport, feeling good enough, self-esteem building to participate and be ready to participate in the adult world. And I think that there's no magic answer, that there will be a population that will always need to have supports, which is why we looked at Centers for Independent Living, vocational rehabilitation. A lot of state agencies then take on the adult concerns around independent living, vocation. And one thing we're doing also now is we're turning these young people that we're seeing grow up and become adults now, asking them to come back and be the mentors. Now pay it forward. And we're seeing so great fun at that. We have what we call brand partners, 3 generations now of the young person grew up and now is giving it back. I'd like to hear someone else speak to how they're seeing the future for adults. Your question?
Well, for life.
Right, yes. Right. Other thoughts?
I think there is no question the huge need for more opportunities for adults to participate, but I do think that those opportunities are growing. I think in part, part of the problem has always been architectural access and access to adaptive equipment. I think there's an amazing adaptive equipment that's being developed now that wasn't around 10 years ago, just for every sport and recreational opportunity you can think of. And also opportunities. In the state universal access program, Tom, I don't know if you want to say anything, that is offered in state parks and in MDC rinks and so on, in hockey and ski. There are opportunities that are around now that weren't around. The other thing I think is that as there are more opportunities for everyone of all abilities, but people with disabilities to be seen, to be on public transportation, to be going to things, to be in the movie theater, I think you're going to see ski slopes opening up more. I think there swimming pools. It's sometimes architectural access, but it's not just that. You can have a movie theater that's accessible, but then their bathroom isn't, or something like that. I think there are going to be changes, but they're going to be gradual. But I think the first step is awareness and visibility, and also I think there are a lot of programs out there, but people don't know about them for adults. And I think that's one thing that a lot of organizations that we interact with are trying to address. Is like, there's all this programming, but how do you find it? And I think that's something that I think people are really working on a lot right now. So.
Glad. I don't know how this answers your question directly, but one of the things that we saw through our historical work, going from the history of youth, is that 22, 21 was not repetitive. That getting folks ready in that population took much longer, and our definition of youth is pretty fluid because of that reason. So we're looking at people up to 26, and that's something that we've transitioned over to our work with youth with disabilities. So that includes not everyone that you're talking about, it includes some of the people that you're talking about.
Hi, I'm Steve. Is this on? Yeah, I'm Steve Espinal, member of the board. I kind of go back to the days a little bit when I first lost my leg. I wasn't even allowed on the ski slopes because they said it was liability reasons. So things have changed dramatically. And I think there's organizations, sometimes not like us, but get siloed. And I always get calls from people who say, Steve, I want to do sports, but they don't even know what they want to do. I mean, they don't know what they're capable of doing and what might interest them. All they know is they want to be moving somewhere and get some motion in their life. So I think we need to have these kind of forums and maybe more cross organizational stuff, because people have their slots that they like. I like to try running, for instance, or there's an organization called Achilles, which works, with mostly right now with veterans, the Wounded Warrior programs. There's lots of things going on all over the country, and that's one of the things that generated most of the technology things that are happening recently, because unfortunately I benefited in many ways from the Vietnam War, from all the research and stuff we've done on prosthetics and stuff there, and now that's increased with Iran and Afghanistan. But I think what needs to be is more of this kind of thing and much more collaboration. For instance, if somebody comes to us and says, I want to do this, and we don't do it, then we know where to send them. Because that's, as Gene was saying, I think that's it. It's more informational, because you can just do anything. It's amazing. Absolutely almost anything. I don't know any sport that you want to participate in, but if you want to try it, there's somebody out there doing it. You may not be able to trick to find you, but there's somebody will train you to do it.
See who looks more.
This is a question for actually all of you. We run a small nonprofit on the South Shore for children with disabilities, and we run after school and summer social development, academic, and recreational programs. And what's interesting, being a small nonprofit on the South Shore, is there's just such a wealth of information and strategy, I feel, for Boston and the inner city. And what would your advice be to community nonprofits who don't have necessarily the same access to the wealth of resources in the city? What would your advice be for us to go and talk and connect and network with more of the urban, the work that you're doing within the city? Because I mean, we go on the grants all the time, and a lot of it is focused for the city kids, and the community kids, we're based out of Situate, they can't necessarily drive into the city to access some of the programs, or they're just really lost.
We heard you.
So basically, it's how do the communities outside of Boston network better with the expertise that seems to be within Boston?
She has funding for you. No.
Great. Thanks, Rob.
I just had a little bit of an idea. I know that there's this State Therapeutic Recreation Association that is part of the, correct me if I'm wrong here, other people know this a little bit better, is it State Parks and Recreation Association? Is that the right name? And they have an annual conference where I think communities all over the state connect. And I also know that in various communities throughout the Commonwealth, there are these 504 coordinators and various recreation departments have great programming. Some have none, some have great, some have in between, and you just have to find them. And I think whoever you can connect with, I think before you know it, you've got a group. And I think the people who are working in the Greater Boston area, I think, are just focused on Greater Boston because, like you've got to start somewhere, and this is where the greatest concentration is. But I think anybody would be, who's involved in any of these sort of concentrated efforts, would be more than happy to, meet with, you or any group, who, outside of the city, who is trying to develop programming or, make your local Y more accessible or whatever. That's off the top of my head. I think, the state's Universal Access Program, but also this Parks and Recreation Association that's statewide, has a therapeutic recreation provider aspect to it. I'm not quite sure. You'd have to do a little web research, but I also have a couple of names I could give you of individuals I know in outlying towns.
We have about 5 minutes, and if we do, we have a couple more questions, and I thought also we'd be remiss if we didn't hear anything from Eli or Diane at some point today. Really? Okay, sorry.
Hi, my name is Meg Stone. I run the Impactability Program at Triangle. This is not a good question for the last 5 minutes, but I will ask it anyway. The program that I run focuses on abuse and violence prevention. And I've been reading recent research not only showing that students with disabilities are more likely to be bullied than students without disabilities, but the incidence of bullying is higher in inclusive settings, particularly for students with autism. So I'm wondering, with all of our efforts, how we address the bullying and violence that is a result of the ableism that you spoke of, that is happening to all students, but it is more concentrated among students with disabilities as we work toward inclusion. And again, that's not a last 5 minutes question, so I appreciate that.
Boy, I wish I could answer this question, definitively. There is no question, regardless of the environment that kids are in, bullying is much more apt to take place in inclusive environments because they're less controlled often than more specialized environments. But sometimes abuse takes place in more specialized environments for a bunch of reasons. But the fact of the matter is, these are really serious issues. And I think schools are doing a lot more in the area of bullying than they certainly did, years ago when I was teaching. But I think we need to do more. And I do think a lot of kids on the spectrum are more apt to be subject to this. But I also think we need to. I have a friend who has a son with Down syndrome, and he was bullied in middle school. And mom is a big advocate for inclusion, and he's been included all the way through school. And when after he was really significantly bullied, I mean actually hit, bullied and abused by another kid in the middle school. She said to me, we need to make this into a learning experience for the middle school. The easiest thing I could do was just take my son out and put him someplace else where he would be safe. But he needs to learn how to deal with bullying. And the school needs to learn how to deal with bullying. And so she worked with the school and so forth. And to make a long story short, by high school, this kid became a friend of this kid with Down syndrome. It was used as a learning experience. And she said, I don't think other kids were abused or bullied like her son had been, because the school had learned, culturally had made a change. And I think that's what we have to constantly, we have to protect kids. We always have to protect kids. But we also, the instinct should not be to segregate. The instinct should be, let's change this environment so that this doesn't happen like before, and let's make this a learning experience for kids with disabilities, because kids with disabilities when they become adults are also more apt to be abused. And sometimes in very serious ways. Sexual abuse, for instance, is much more common among adults with disabilities than non-disabled people. And so we need to start very, very young in dealing with these issues directly with both kids who have disabilities and kids who don't.
That's where you teach. You have to. All right, here we go.
Thanks so much, Ross, for convening for all the speakers. Thank you all so much for your remarks. My name's Eli. I work at the Institute for Human-Centered Design, and I was a former Paralympic athlete. And I wasn't quite involved with the process with the guidance at the national level. There was about 5 or 6 national organizations I worked together to draft the guidance, and it was actually based a lot on Title IX, and then working with the Department of Ed, and a number of groups came together. And I guess a lot of it was based around, and it wasn't really touched upon, but in terms of the whole notion of nothing about us without us, which is really, and even just thinking about today, and thinking about who's in the room and who's not in the room, just that's an important part of this process, is that people with disabilities themselves, you spoke about it a little bit in terms of people in leadership positions, but I know that is really important because oftentimes kids and adults don't have an opportunity to be in that leadership position, but with the mentorship and with these different pieces to actually be the ones to actually speak what their rights are and how they can actually be able to access sports. Oftentimes sports is exclusive, but now we're having this paradigm shift to see, well, how can we come into the mindset of inclusivity? I guess the one thing I would just challenge us about with this community is, again, thinking about who's not in the room. I still feel like a lot of the stakeholders that need to be in the room, like the schools and the health system, all the government officials. I still think we need to get more people in the room to have the conversation with us. I mean, I really think that now with the guidance, I think we need to be able to work more collaboratively directly with the school system. Some of the comments that came out by the public schools when the guidance came out were a little bit, they kind of took me aback because they were bringing up concerns about safety and, what do we do with kids that can't walk? So we need to, it's an educational process. It's the journey that we're beginning. And so I think that it's important that there's so many amazing leaders in the room here. And I just hope we can all keep going forward. So thank you, Ross, for bringing us together.
We probably should pay attention to time, so I apologize. We'll leave with the final vision is, this is a sport vision, but this is Nate's vision. We want the perfect game. We want a perfect game in which everyone is challenged to their utmost, working their hardest, and all abilities are valued and equally part of each team and each play. And it's a game that would be developed so that if you put it in as extracurricular activity, the so-called typical population kids would want to be in it, and they'd be begging to be a part of it. We do camps every year in which this is part and parcel of what we do in a camp every year. By the end of the camp, everything, your life is focused on achieving or winning this cup of this integrated perfect game and perfect week of competition. So, I used to be a minister. Everybody knows this, right? So let's no. So every profession has, or vocation has its way of getting out of a situation, right? And ministers would be, regardless of comfortability or being uncomfortable with, pray out of things, right? It's like, great, let's pray, and you back out. So since I retired to do this full time, we cheer out of situations, okay? And no one, if you're not smiling now, no one is above this, okay? If I want to hear a reason. If someone thinks they're above doing cheer, I want to hear right now. Okay? So here's the cheer. It's, oh my gosh, oh by golly, we are faster than streetcar, move. Okay? Isn't this great? Okay. You ready? Oh my gosh, we are faster than a streetcar, move.